Castlevania: The Adventure is the first entry in Konami's Castlevania series to grace the Nintendo Game Boy, depicting the simple tale of vampire killer Christopher Belmont and his struggles against the vampire lord Count Dracula. You know, the typical Castlevania story back when it was oh so simple and not overtly complicated or perhaps convoluted as it had been in recent years. Now there have been other NES games or game series that had made the transition to Game Boy with favorable results. Super Mario Land, Mega Man, and Metroid 2 just to name a couple examples. But with Castlevania The Adventure, the series got a rather shaky beginning on the Game Boy. Like I said, Castlevania The Adventure tells the story of Christopher Belmont, an ancestor of more famous Belmonts such as Simon, Richter, and Julius Caesar Belmont. Like all other Belmonts before and since, Christopher is armed with his trusty vampire killer whip and must venture through 4 levels of terror to fulfill the Belmont destiny of slaying the vampire lord Count Dracula, who has once again awakened from his century-long slumber. Unlike other Belmonts before or since, Christopher lacks the ability or knowledge to use any of the signature sub-weapons associated with the Castlevania series. He climbs ropes instead of stairs, his whip power is pretty unstable, and his jumping prowess sucks. For a first-generation Game Boy title, Castlevania The Adventure's graphics are fairly decent. The environments are fairly detailed, they look alright for the most part. Belmont looks a bit bald, but that's okay, the enemy design isn't particularly impressive either. They look rather bland and generic by early Castlevania standards at least, but on their own merits they look okay-ish. Animation's kinda stiff, but otherwise not a big deal. Not much to say about the sound effects, are really nothing special. However, the soundtrack's actually pretty decent, with the first and final levels of the game being the best of the bunch in terms of music. The rest of it isn't really memorable stuff per se, but it's perfectly acceptable fare, which is more than what I could say for the gameplay. You know, the part where you actually play the game. Castlevania The Adventure boasts 4 levels of play. Doesn't sound like a long game, but the levels do have considerable length, and thanks to certain issues, they feel a lot longer than usual. Adventure attempts to bring some semblance of Castlevania gameplay over to the portable Game Boy by having Christopher use a whip to slay enemies and strike candles for various items and coins. It's the bare minimum of a Castlevania title, which is more than what you get from those old Tiger Electronic handheld games, if you're old enough to remember those things. But this is the Game Boy, which is capable of so much more. As I have said before, there are no sub-weapons to collect, no familiar enemies or bosses to battle aside from the Count himself, the familiar Castlevania death track replaced with a poor imitation, and none of the familiar treasures to find. Oh, you could still power up your whip into a chain whip and further upgrade with the ability to shoot fireballs, your only long-range weapon on this adventure. However, for some strange, inexplicable reason, each hit from an enemy, projectile, hazard will downgrade your whip by 1 level until you're back to the flimsy tassel of a leather whip. A penalty that has not been implemented in any prior Castlevania, so unless you know Adventure really well and can avoid damage, expect to be stuck with a lowly whip for the majority of the game. Why this penalty was added, nobody will ever know, but it is a major contribution to the overall fake difficulty of the game. And make no mistake, The Adventure is a rather difficult game. Unfortunately, the difficulty is due less to whatever semblance of legitimate challenge that exists, but rather due to the sluggish control and poor platforming. Aside from the unstable whip power, you also have to contend with lots of jumping across narrow blocks, climbing ropes, avoiding obstacles, slaying enemies, and hoping to make it through the damn level in one piece. The problem is that Belmont moves with about as much speed and finesse as a slug, and his leaps do not cover much distance. As a result, what should have been a case of relatively easy yet tedious platforming efforts is ultimately compounded by your Belmont's limited jumping abilities. Most of the time you'd have to jump just as you're on the verge of walking off the very edge of a platform to fully cross a rather small gap that any competent jumper can reach. More than the enemies, the poor level design, and the deviously placed pitfalls, this inability to properly tackle the challenges before you is the main factor in making a seemingly moderate difficult game even more of a chore to play. You know what, Castlevania The Adventure isn't so much a game than it is a test of patience. A test to determine whether you have the patience to put up with 4 levels of excessive platforming and extremely sluggish gameplay. The game had the bare bones nailed to a point, and therefore had the basis to be a decent, if unspectacular, Castlevania adventure. But unfortunately, it all boils down to poor controls overall. I mean, if the controls were a bit more responsive and you were better equipped to deal with the challenges before you, the game could have been pretty good. Not much more than that. As it is, I can't recommend this title to anyone other than the Castlevania purist that has to play every single Castlevania game out there, and even then, you might want to think twice before pursuing this adventure.